All right, here we go. It's the System Failure Podcast, number 77. Wow, what's going on, Nate?
Hello, Brian. And number 77 indeed. We're delighted to report that the weather in Maine is substantially better than it was last weekend when we were doing the storm version of the podcast. But we are doing the podcast in an unusual location this week. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, the big news for you and me is that our middle brother, Jason, who haunted this pod with his wife, Grace, a couple, 3-4 weeks ago, have given birth to their child, a young daughter. Obviously, she's going to be young, being, mere hours old. But one of the youngest people on the planet, quite a distinction. Young Beatrix is the newest member of our family. So we're very excited about that, aren't we, Brian? It feels a little weird because we're like an emotionally constipated family. But I'm still happy for Jason and Grace. My only wish would have been, I wish they would have had 2 kids and had a son first and then a daughter, just to see look on our mom's face, because that woman cannot get a daughter or a granddaughter to save her life. So I just feel like getting the daughter first, we may have foregone a little bit of comedy. So I just say that with a gentle wink and a nudge at our mom, who's going to be delighted to finally have reinforcements on the female side of the balance sheet, something she's not enjoyed since 1983.
Well, shout out to Jason and Grace there. And, I guess they gave birth to like a massive baby. And I guess, Mom has her glorious catharsis that's been like 50 years, 30 years in the works, I guess. I don't know how to...
Well, I'm 41, and so I know Mom's been planning for a daughter for at least 41 years. Yeah. Probably more, but I think we can at least, round it off to 40. So congratulations for them. I really, really hope I'm not raising the curtain too much, but, they had a little bit of trouble, with fertility, so it's just really nice to see Jason and Grace with baby here and healthy. So I'm feeling gratified anyway. And I'm excited to meet this new character in our lives. Whenever they're ready to have people come over and check them out.
I mean, one thing about childbirth, see, I guess you call like the baby like baby instead of, I don't know, the baby like the rapper or something.
Like little baby. Oh, I see. Yeah.
It's a lot of like people like lose they no longer identified by their names, and now it's like baby and mother. And it seems a little foreign to me. I don't know if I have kids suddenly, I guess it's just like a new association, or maybe your mind shift, changes or something. But I don't know. Anyway.
Well, I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of getting used to things for Jason and Grace. The baby, not so much, because she doesn't know anything but this, but for them, their whole conception of who they are and what they're doing, I'm sure has shifted these past 24 hours. But we'll get confirmation of that. But when they give them a month or two to get their feet under them, we'll invite them back in the pod. We'll get their feedback into what the happy experience of childbirth is like. Maybe they'll tell us it was horrifying. I don't think they will, though. I think they won't remember the horror, and they will remember the fulfillment. I think we'll have to get them, the new experts, in here to divulge their opinion, though, eh?
We'll have to see. I wonder what it's like to are you like instantly thrown into like the front lines, or like the fires of children crying and changing diapers, or do the children like ease you into it, or is it just instantly you're on like the front lines?
That's a great question. Let's just say I got no idea and leave it at that. But I'm really looking forward to hearing, as mentioned, Jason and Grace's testimony on this matter. That'll be interesting.
Well, I'm glad, they've gone through the breach first.
Yeah, I think I said it on the pod when they were here, but for me, the older brother, who bullied Jason when he was younger, it's very gratifying for me to see Jason cross the bridge into fatherhood, be the first one across the bridge. I feel like there's a certain poetry to be found, or maybe I'm just superimposing my own idiotic sentimentality on the situation. I can never be sure which, but there it is.
All right, cool.
All right, so I mentioned at the top of the pod that we are recording today in my house and not Brian's studio, where we usually record. And the reason for that is the automotive misfortunes of me and the lovely Tracy are mounting. We obviously, with the winter here, there's any number of fender benders that can happen to your car. And when we were coming back from Illinois for our grandmother's funeral, Tracy picked us up in the airport a few hours after we recorded this August pod in the O'Hare International Airport. And when she did, she had to confess that it was snowing and really stormy that day, and that the car had been in a second car accident. We had a first one in December that really wasn't Tracy's fault. Then we had one where Tracy's just hit the brakes, but it was just so slidey out that she, these are fender benders, and we're not talking about airbags going off. So anyhow, that car's finally gone down to Moody's, the local repair shop. It's one of these, Moody's is the owner of Moody's, like runs for governor here in the state, the state of Maine. So it's a pretty big deal. My hockey team is called the Moody's Old Rex because we're sponsored by Moody's, and we are in fact Old Rex. So it all works out. So my car being in Moody's, for repairs, we've been relying on Tracy's 2013 Hyundai Elantra, which is really getting into junker status now at 12 years old. And then yesterday, that car died on us. Tracy was driving it to the IGA to pick up a few sundries, and the engine started misfiring. And you know that when you're six cylinders, when the cylinders don't fire in order, you get like crazy shaking going on. The check engine light came on. We really thought 'twas the end of the line, but we got a call from the repair depot a few hours ago, and they tell us that it's just going to be the spark plugs just need to be changed, just need to be fixed, so we can keep it going for $600-700 something like that.
Yeah, that's a relief. Wait, I just have a question.
Yeah.
Did you explain to the folks at Moody's that they sponsor your hockey team and that you should get some special treatment?
Well, I think I already get special treatment there because I know my main man Dan down at Moody's a few years ago. Some woman hit Tracy when she was driving my car down in New Jersey, and the accident was like totally their fault, and their insurance company was horrible in jerking us around, and this guy Dan was really hilarious in the sarcastic way he dealt with their fly-by-night insurance agency, and they ended up paying thousands and thousands of dollars more for rental cars than was necessary because their agents were incompetent and wouldn't communicate clearly with the shop. So the point is, my main man Dan knows me down there, so I feel like I'm in good without even having to mention that I play for the Moody's hockey team. So I did not drop that breadcrumb, Brian, to answer your question directly.
All right. Do you think that the folks at Moody's know they have a hockey team?
Yeah, we took a picture at the end of the season. We take a picture of all of us in our jerseys so that there's something to put on the propaganda wall at Moody's to show their community outreach efforts. You know how it works. Something like that. Yeah. So yeah, at least there's a picture of us all, sweaty guys in our hockey jerseys, in our Moody's Old Rex hockey jerseys to grace the walls of the actual repair center.
Next to like the T-ball team with 5-year-olds.
Yeah, that is exactly what you should be picturing.
Nice.
So we had to have Brian drive to me. So you drove here, picked me up, and we drove to your apartment in the snowstorm last week because there was like snow everywhere, and I had no all-wheel drive. And so this week you just came here, and rather than make you drive twice up over hill and under Dale, we're just going to make you suffer once here.
And schlep the equipment over.
Yeah.
Yes, I sure am carrying the podcast on my back for the past couple weeks.
Yeah. Well, continue doing it. It works out well for me when you do. Okay, so additionally, as the longtime listeners of this pod may know, the lovely Tracy suffered an eye injury in 2013. She's still slowly recovering from, so we had a checkup eye appointment down in Boston. By the way, she's doing great. We got a close-up image of her eye, and the scar that's blocking her vision in that eye is all pixelated into just a ton of tiny little dots now. Like it's not even a solid shield of a scar anymore. So old Tracy's on the mend, I'm happy to report, but we had to take the bus down to Boston. Because I didn't have the car, obviously. We just have Tracy's junker, not really reliable enough for the highway.
That sounds, was there like some crazy old man masturbating?
No, we did really well. We're, like the Logan bus. So here in Portland, Maine, Concord Trailways runs like a dozen times a day. They run down to Boston. And some of those routes go to South Station. Some go to Logan, some go to both. But we were on the South Station only bus. There's only like 2 people. The Logan bus is always packed with crazy people smoking pot in the bathroom. But these are really nice buses too. It's like crazy that people do that, but they do everything they can to make the coach. They have free Wi-Fi. They're very luxurious and nice, but people still desecrate the bathroom. But that's not really why I wanted to bring this trip up. There's 2 reasons. One, lots of Canadians, lots of Team USA and Team Canada hockey jerseys oot and a boot on the frigid streets of Boston on Thursday in preparation for that massive 4 Nations game on Thursday night. Brian, did you get a chance to watch any of the overtime action, or did you forget about the game and fall asleep?
I wanted to watch it, and then I think I fell asleep.
I see. Well, I had hockey on Thursday night, but I rushed out to I had Tracy's junker, of course, at hockey. Rushed out to the car, listened to the second period on the radio, and got home in time. Good time for the third period. It was and overtime. Great hockey, as you probably saw. Connor McDavid managed to score in overtime on a notable defensive lapse from our main man, Mitch Marner, humiliating himself on TD Garden ice as usual in consequential games. But I had to hand it to the Canadians. Not only were their jerseys better, but they just have unimaginable talent. And Team USA did a great job matching them stride for stride. But let's be real, this is Canada in the end. It's their game. And just like Nathan McKinnon and Connor McDavid and Sidney Crosby. It unbelievable juggernaut of a team. But great hockey, and we weren't able. You at Team USA and the Donald weren't able to get one over on the Canucks this time. But we'll get our revenge 2 years hence at the Olympics, eh, Brian?
Hopefully, fingers crossed.
You probably saw that the Donald called Team USA on the Thursday morning of the game. I don't know if you saw Coach Mike Sullivan's comments about that.
I did not.
One of the reporters said, did the Donald mention anything about annexing Canada again? And Mike Sullivan was like, oh, yeah, he did bang on about that for a few minutes, but we really are focused on the game here, folks.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was a fun chapter in the Donald's rankling of the Canadians, and I don't mind that they won. They really had sweet jerseys. I think I mentioned this once already, but I really want to drive the point home to our valued system failure audience that the Canadian hockey jerseys are cracking. It's too bad Team USA can't match some of their sartorial cues and fashion some jerseys that are worthy of our country, but be what it be.
So did we really boo during the Canadian national anthem?
Yes, they did boo. And now I was on the ice myself, so I only got to watch the replays, but the TD Garden announcer, whose name I don't remember anymore, they had the one announcer my whole life, and they replaced him a few years ago, and I got no idea who was doing the announcing, but they had a lengthy public service announcement. Please do not boo the national anthems. We're trying to, and the crazy Bostonians booed the hell out of the Canadian national anthem anyway. So that was awesome. Pretty cool. Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll get one over on the Canadians and annex their country.
I mean, I can't imagine, but at least the Donald's different. And it is kind of the idea of actually annexing Canada is seems silly to me. So it seems amusing. This just all seems like the funny posturing of some kind of a crazy alpha male strongman type, Well,
I'm going to make a bold prediction that at the end of the Donald administration, there will still be 50 states. If any change in the states happen, there might be less states as someone secedes from the union.
Right. So you're putting your money on the over-under, the differential of 0 states added or subtracted.
Well, certainly none added.
None added. So you're going with the under.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Brian, I did also want to bring up this trip down to Boston because I committed a misdeed or a lack of discipline. You see, I had these hours on the bus to kill, and I was like, what am I going to do for the hours? Will I bring my book? No, I sideloaded the Reddit app on my phone. So I relapsed and went back and read it on Thursday. And man, let me tell you, I could really tell that it had a major impact on the way that I think, the way that my mind works. With those infinite scrolls, any kind of thing that has an infinite scroll, just a list that keeps going and going and going, you just end up on this insane dopamine hunt. You're just looking for the next dopamine hit. And the carousel, the circuit from seeking dopamine to getting dopamine is so rapid and fast. It's one right after another that you just end up, your mind doesn't think in paragraphs. It just thinks in hurried little bites instead. And it just made me really think about how I'd been off Reddit I announced my retirement from Reddit on this August podcast maybe a month ago or something. It hasn't been that long since I've been off of it, but I can just feel it rewiring my brain. And I think this is the case with, again, any infinite scroll. We talk about this all the time, but in Google, it used to be you had to go to page 2 and page 3. But in the past 10 years or so, all of the websites have changed to the infinite scroll where it just loads the next results for you as you scroll without having to click to the next page. I think that is really deleterious to the human brain. And my opinions were certainly reinforced by my experiences on Reddit on Thursday.
Well, I've basically stayed off the Reddit since we talked about it a few weeks ago. Yeah. I mean, I've gone on there a few times, but I haven't probably spent it's probably been under an hour my total Reddit time in the past 3 weeks, which is a huge improvement. And it definitely makes you feel a lot better. I think it does do terrible things to your attention. Being jacked up on anything is not good. It's interesting if you ever sit down and try to do some kind of meditation or breathing practice. It's funny how your mind so there's 2 parts of your attention and your mind are 2 separate faculties available to you.
Your attention and your mind. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, keep going.
Because your mind clamors for you're trying to put your attention on your breathing or on your body, which is, I think, a nourishing thing to do. You're basically shining the light of God on your workings, which is restorative and makes you feel not worn down to a nub, the opposite of that.
Yeah. This is the symbol of the Eye of Horus, right? It categorizes the divinity of human attention, the perception.
Right, and when you put that attention on poisonous, and toxic online content that's just designed to get your attention, you're just depleting yourself. But it's funny how you're when you try to meditate though, your mind will try to it fights for your attention like a child will try to fight for the attention from adults. It's such a bizarre thing. And I don't know, it's easy to be out of control. And yeah, I don't know.
My brain feels like an out of control movie projector when I try to meditate. It's clattering along. It's like, quack, 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 quack. It's like, please, let's not watch Die Hard now. We're trying to focus on X, Y, or Z, whatever the object of your attention is, and your brain just keeps wanting to go off in these other directions. And the more that you go on the internet, and the more you have the internet feeding you, like reading, you have to like force it. You have to like read, and you have to like push when you're reading. You know, you have to like or pull maybe. You have to pull when you're reading. You have to actively engage your attention with each sentence. Right? It kind of takes a little bit of energy. You know, you have a battery that sort of depletes, and eventually you get tired of reading. But the internet loads the next thing for you, and then the next thing for you, and then the next thing for you. And so I want to agree with like 97% with everything you've said. Like, it seems to me, just to repeat what you were saying, Brian, it sounded like you were suggesting that there's like a mental model of the universe, like what you know, like your brain, like your mind, right? You have this like model of reality, and then there's your attention, which is like the list of all those things prioritized, right? And just the only dynamic that I think the only wiggle I would introduce into that is like, it does seem like Reddit, when I'm scrolling through Reddit, I'm looking to add something else to my model of reality. I'm looking for novelty, in other words, you know? So it does seem like, yeah, I would separate what I'm saying is that there's your mind on the one hand and your attention, absolutely, as you said. And then it seems like the thing that connects them is that your attention is the hierarchical list of that model of things that you should be, I can only pay attention to one thing at a time. So what is the thing I should be focused on? Like, and if there's a picture of a naked woman on your internet screen, for example, well, that will be promoted right at the top of your hierarchy to the exclusion of all else, right? You won't even be aware of what's going on around you. So it's, yeah, I really like the way you described it. In other words, your mind, your attention is thinking of them as like different faculties of your brain or something like that. But.
Well, you're thinking is like this tool that's available to our mind. And it's, I think, if you haven't examined it, like thinking just seems like who you are.
Yeah.
But really, it's more like part of who you are.
Yes, I like that. Yeah.
And well, you have like the Eye of Horus or maybe the Eye of Sauron, and you can choose where you shine that.
Yeah.
And putting it on the thinking. Well, I mean, obviously, thinking can be a useful tool. But I mean, obviously you can like overthink situations, especially like, well, just like anxiety is like so like replete.
Oh yeah, talking to the hot chick at the end of the bar, that's your classic overthinking. I think that is like the classic time when everyone overthinks, like instead of just going up there and start your feet moving, and when you get there, just start your lips and tongue moving and hope for the best. You know, that's well anyway. Yes, yeah, exactly.
And there's kind of a split between. Like action and reflection are two different things, and I don't know. You need like a standard approach. Like you don't want to be someone who takes action and never thinks.
Yes, yeah.
But you don't want to like only be thinking. And the whole Reddit thing just like hijacks the whole system and takes over the whole process, so that you're not really like conscious of what you're doing, and eventually you just get worn down to a nub.
It's like. It's like you can be mindful of what you're focusing your attention on. That is meditation, right? Or you can let Reddit make that decision for you. You can just outsource that and just let Reddit feed you whatever garbage it wants to feed you about how the Donald's the next coming of Hitler or whatever, or whatever the thing is, whatever the ridiculous thing that Reddit wants to spoon feed you. That's the next thing you're going to be paying attention to. And
did you like find anything good on Reddit, or was it all just completely? Is it all like, dust in the wind?
Well, I like the Wall Street Bets subreddit, but I can't remember anything I read on there on Thursday. I was just doing it for entertainment to pass the 2 hours there and the 2 hours back, and I feel like an addict who's relapsed. It's just I really thought, I don't know. I was so sure when I was announcing my retirement from Reddit, I knew that it was deleterious to my brain. But then I like fooled myself on Thursday morning. I was like, I can go on Reddit for the bus ride. I'll just delete the app afterward, which I did. But like it is now Saturday. 2 days after I was on Reddit, I can just still feel the effects. It really is remarkable. I can't believe I did that for so many years, not noticing how profound the effect is.
I think also a big thing is just that when you're young, you've got what we'd call like a lot of jing, and it's easy. It's a lot easier to it's a lot easier to abuse your body and not feel the terrible effects.
Yeah.
So that's like another way they get you when you're young, and then when you get to be in your 30s and you're a quivering heap and don't know why. That's like one of the reasons.
You've waxed poetic on this pod, Brian, about this idea of economy of motion, the way that pro athletes move. And yeah, as you get older, you have to develop some economy. You're right. You have an excess of energy, an excess of attention, an excess of everything when you're young. But then as those natural forces start to subside, you have to start to be smart about where and when you choose to outlay your calories.
Yeah. You want to be like a grizzled veteran hockey player. I mean, they're not as youthful or quick or as anything as the younger players, but they are smarter and have that economy of motion and know what they're doing. And so you want to be like, Jaromir Jagr and stay in the league until you're like 46.
And you remember Nick Lidstrom, the defenseman who played all those years for the Red Wings?
Yes.
Yeah, that dude. I remember when the Wings won back-to-back cups in 98 and 99. And then Lidstrom was still on the team when they won in 08, was it? I think it was 08 that the Red Wings won and the Penguins won. I'm mixing up. I can't remember exactly which year it was. But the point is that Lidstrom was unbelievable. He wasn't fast at all, but he could see the game. He would just skate slowly to where the puck was going to be, and it would come to him like every time. It was just wild. I mean, so that is the economy of motion that you want to have. You want to have that sort of mental acuity. You want to have the mental acuity that matches that sort of economy of motion. Lidstrom is the one that comes most readily to my mind, of course.
Yeah. Well, it's a good topic, I think. You don't really hear many people talking about the challenges of being like an overstimulated millennial who's now in their 30s and trying to negotiate the world.
Yeah.
So that is the system failure difference right here.
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, we're early on the call here, Brian. I think that 5-10 years from now, we're going to be talking about how Instagram is every bit as horrible for kids as those cigarette vending machines that were around in the 80s when we were kids. I think we're going to be talking about Facebook in those terms very soon, and a lot of people like us already are already.
Yeah. We are ahead of the curve here.
All right, Brian. Well, I think that about does it for our preamble. I think with that brief foray into the world of dopamine cultivation and motivation and mental health.
What exciting system failure topics do you have for us this week, Nate?
So I just have one big topic that I wanted to read. So many system failure listeners may have heard the name Neil Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson is one of these Oxford Don types from Scotland. I wanted to do my best fat bastard accent to try to impersonate Niall. But I think I'll spare everyone my fat bastard accent. But just imagine a little bit of a Scottish brogue when the man talks. It adds to his charm. Now, Mr. Ferguson is a historian. He now works for Stanford University out in Cali. He's not in the Scottish Highlands anymore. But he had a great essay in the Wall Street Journal this week that's all about like government debt. And because Mr. Ferguson, he's like a writer, right? He writes really excellent prose. And so I thought I would read this article, and then you and I will discuss it. So if our system failure listeners will bear with me, I'll now do an essay read. I think you'll agree that this is pretty good. But here is the piece in its entirety. I present this with a request for your apologies and for your indulgence. This essay is entitled "Debt Has Always Been the Ruin of Great Powers. Is the U.S. Next?" And subtitled, "From Habsburg Spain to Trump's America, there's no escaping the consequences of spending more on interest payments than on defense." Is that the heady scent of hubris wafting through the winter air of Washington, D.C.? So bold has President Trump been in the first months of his second term that nervous Europeans wonder if the American Republic is now unabashedly an empire. Trump renames seas. He reclaims canals. He demands Greenland. He trolls Canada. His proposal for peace in Gaza is wholesale resettlement of its population. His plan for peace in Ukraine begins to look a lot like partition. In the ancient Hellenic world, Hubris was the kind of pride or arrogance that led a mortal to defy the gods. But hard on its heels, there usually came Nemesis, the goddess of divine retribution. The historian prefers to exclude deities from his narrative. He discerns the more prosaic operation of budgetary constraints. For it is these, not gods, that set limits on the geopolitical ambitions of republic and empires alike. What I call Ferguson's Law states that any great power that spends more on debt service than on defense risks ceasing to be a great power. The insight is not mine, but originates with the Scottish political theorist Adam Ferguson, whose essay on the history of civil society from 1667 brilliantly identified the perils of excessive public debt. Ferguson understood that modern economists call the tax smoothing properties of public debt. By borrowing to pay for a war or some other emergency, a government can spread the cost over multiple generations of taxpayers. But he also saw the catch. Quote, the growing burden, he observed, is gradually laid, unquote. And though a nation may, quote, sink in some future age, every minister hopes it may still keep afloat in his own, unquote. For this reason, public debt is, quote, extremely dangerous in the hands of a precipitant and ambitious administration, unquote. His conclusion was prophetic. An expense, whether sustained at home or abroad, whether a waste of the present or an anticipation of future revenue, if it brings no proper return, it is to be reckoned among the causes of national ruin. Economists have long sought in vain a threshold that defines how much debt is too much. My own formulation of Adam Ferguson's idea focuses our attention on the crucial relationship between debt service, which is the interest plus repayment of principal, and national security, which is expenditure on defense, including investment in research and development. The crucial threshold is where debt service exceeds defense spending, after which the centripetal forces of aggregate debt burden tend to pull apart the geopolitical grip of a great power, leaving it vulnerable to military challenge. And here the journal prints a graph of net interest outlays and of defense, and these as a percentage of GDP. And you can see that the two lines cross this past year in 2024. And that is to say, we began this past year spending more on paying back our federal debt than we did on all of our defense spending combined. Back to the article. The striking thing is that, for the first time in nearly a century, the U.S. began violating Ferguson's Law last year. Annual defense spending, to be precise, the national defense consumption expenditures and gross investment, was $1.1 trillion in 2024, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. While federal expenditures on interest payment, the government long ago gave up on paying down principal, topped out at $1.1 trillion as well. These outlays can also be expressed as percentages of gross domestic product. The Congressional Budget Office, which uses a narrower definition of defense spending than the BEA does, places it at 2.9% of GDP for last year. Net interest payments, which is adjusting the interest received by bonds held by government agencies, amounted to 3.1%. We have seen nothing like this since the age of isolationism. Between 1962 and 1989, U.S. defense spending averaged 6.4% of GDP. Debt service was less than a third of that at 1.8%. Even after the end of the Cold War, the federal government was still spending, on average, roughly twice as much on national security as on interest on the debt. The fact that the U.S. is currently projected to spend a rising share of its GDP on interest payments and a falling share on defense means that American power is much more fiscally constrained than most people realize. By 2049, according to the CBO's latest long-term budget projection, net interest payments on the federal debt will have risen to 4.9% of GDP. If defense spending maintains its recent share of discretionary spending, it will amount to half that share of GDP. Nor is there any real possibility that defense spending will increase dramatically. Because such spending is discretionary, it has to be appropriated by Congress every year, unlike spending on entitlement programs, which is mandatory, and interest payment, non-payment of which would be default. If anything, budgetary constraints are likely to put downward pressure on defense spending in the decades ahead. And now Mr. Ferguson is going to give us some history, which I really enjoyed this bit here. This is good stuff. We're going to talk about the Habsburgs first. Remember the Spanish Habsburgs, Brian? These are the guys that were like crazily retarded from decades of inbreeding. Right? While the Austrian Habsburgs introduced new blood into their family lines, the Spanish Habsburgs inbred to the point where it was Charles II, I think, was the last Habsburg king of Spain, and he was so badly retarded he couldn't speak and just drooled, couldn't reproduce, couldn't really think. It was just a grotesque, like the most, I don't want to say the most grotesque example of inbreeding I know of in history. So keep that in mind. We're about to talk about the Habsburgs here. The next section here is subtitled Empires Crippled by Debt. Ferguson's law that it is dangerous for a great power to spend more on debt service than on defense is borne out by history. In the 16th century, the Habsburg kings of Castile reigned over the first truly global empire. Revenues from American silver mines were crucial to financing Spain's expansive military endeavors. Charles V and Philip II also enjoyed substantial tax revenues from their Castilian subjects. But with every passing decade, the Spanish Empire relied more on borrowing. It issued juros, which are long-term bonds held mostly by the Castilian elite. It also raised funds by selling asientos, short-term IOUs to bankers in Genoa and elsewhere. The system was stable until 1600, when Spain began to illustrate Adam Fergus's point. The total stock of juros grew by a factor of 3.4 between 1594 and 1687, at a time when the revenues of the crown stagnated. Payments on the juros went from absorbing half of Spanish revenue in 1667 to 87% just 20 years later. As Philip IV told the Council of the Indies even earlier in 1639, quote, "I recognize that the introduction of the juros has caused the enormous ruin we experience," unquote. Between 1607 and 1662, the Spanish crown defaulted on part of its debt 5 times. Not coincidentally, the growth in per capita GDP that characterized the golden age of the 16th century was followed by contraction in the 17th century. This in turn reduced the crown's tax revenues. The geopolitical repercussions were unavoidable. In 1640, Portugal regained its independence after 60 years of dynastic union. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 marked the formal recognition of Dutch independence and the effective end of Spain's predominance in Europe. The Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659 further underscored its diminished status as Spain ceded territory to France. Perhaps the most familiar case of great power succumbing to its fiscal constraints is that of Bourbon France in its contest with Hanoverian Britain in the late 18th century. We all know about the Hanoverian Britons, right? This is like George I, II, III, and IV. Remember King George III, against whom we revolted here in the United States to win our independence. And I think Victoria would be the last of the Hanoverian monarchs, lasting until late into the 19th century. Anyhow, let us return to the struggle between Bourbon France and Hanoverian Britain. Of all the great powers, France had the greatest difficulty in evolving a stable system of public debt management. There was no central bank that could issue banknotes. There was no liquid bond market where government debt could be bought and sold. The tax system had, in large measure, been privatized. Instead of selling bonds, the French crown sold offices, creating a bloated public payroll. London, by contrast, established not only a central bank and a relatively efficient tax system, but also a thriving bond market. Now here it's Nate again interrupting. Like we all remember that the Bank of England was formed in the late 1600s, and the Freemasons came out of hiding just a few decades later in the early 1700s. So the British really pioneered this whole idea of having a central bank and having a debt-based currency. French intervention, we're going back to the article now. French intervention in support of the American colonists, culminating at Yorktown in 1781, may have appeared a strategic masterstroke. But the fiscal consequences took Louis XVI's government far beyond the limits of Ferguson's law. In 1780, debt service absorbed 2/5 of total expenditure. The War Department, just a quarter. By 1788, debt service rose above half of total expenditure. The history of the 19th century furnishes further examples. The Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, Tsarist Russia. But the best example of all, and the one from which Americans have the most to learn, is that of Great Britain. This next section is subtitled, The Economics of Appeasement. On 3 occasions in its history, major wars against continental rivals. First, France between 1792 and 1815, and then Germany twice in the 20th century, drove the British national debt above 150% of GDP. At times, despite the breadth and depth of the UK bond market, this led to violations of Ferguson's law. For example, in the 1820s and again in the 1870s. But the general trend in the 19th century was for the costs of debt service to decline, thanks to the productivity gains of the Industrial Revolution and the peacetime surpluses run by Victorian chancellors of the Exchequer. This left room for the rearmament that ensured Britannia ruled the waves, as well as for the largest land empire in history. Unfortunately, because Britain's army remained small by continental standards, in 1914, London could not prevent Germany from launching its first bid for mastery in Europe. Just a little aside here, we all remember the story of the Baghdad-Berlin Railroad, right, Brian? When we're talking about the origins of World War I, right? The story is that the Germans were on the cusp of completing this railroad from Iraq into Berlin that would have delivered oil into Europe and made the British shipping fleet superfluous for the purposes of oil production and distribution. And so they started funding nationalists within the Austro-Hungarian Empire along the route of this Baghdad-Berlin Railway. And that, of course, means financing the Black Hand terrorist group of Serbian separatists, right? And so, of course, it's a Serb, young Gavrilo Princip, who assassinates the Archduke, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and touches off World War I. That was just my little flavor. Apologies there. In the wake of World War I, back to the article now, debt service exceeded military spending every year from 1920 to 1936. It was this breach of Ferguson's law, much more than any trust or sympathy toward Adolf Hitler, that inspired the policy of appeasement. Of paramount importance to the Treasury was the concern that higher spending on armaments would jeopardize Britain's precarious recovery from the Great Depression. In seeking to appease Hitler, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain failed, of course, to deter him and his Confederates from launching another world war. Despite the fact that UK defense spending rose above debt service in 1937, the signal was not sufficiently strong to dissuade Hitler from invading Poland, even when accompanied by an explicit pledge of support for Poland in the event of a threat to its independence. The most that belated rearmament was able to achieve was to ensure that the British military survived the retreat from Dunkirk and won the Battle of Britain. Another world war left Britain with another mountain of debt. In the decades after 1945, Britain relied much more on unanticipated inflation than on productivity growth to keep the cost of debt service below the costs of defense. The British case illustrates that defying Ferguson's law need not doom a great power to swift decline. Britain crossed the limit in 3 periods after the mid-19th century, but in each time it was able to cross back. Decline inexorably came as inflation and low productivity growth forced successive governments to give up colonies and to shrink the armed services. Still, the United Kingdom avoided defeat and immediate dissolution, the fate of many another great power. And the last section here is entitled Warning Signs for the U.S. What are the implications for America today? Well, geopolitically, the U.S. finds itself in a situation comparable with that of Britain in the 1930s. Its military commitments are global, as has been true since 1945, and it confronts a new axis of authoritarian powers. Yet, America's fiscal position is far more constrained today than ever before. The U.S. government is now in violation of Ferguson's law and is likely to move further beyond its crucial limit in the coming decades. Can the U.S., like Victorian and interwar Britain, find a way back? Can it do even better successfully deterring its foes, as Britain failed to deter Germany, and averting the possibility of a ruinous World War III? Or is America doomed to follow Habsburg Spain, the Ottoman Empire, Bourbon France, and Austria-Hungary down the path of default, depreciation, and imperial decline, even revolution? There are 4 important differences between Britain in the 1930s and the U.S. in the 1920s, and all of them work to America's disadvantage. First, the term structure of U.S. debt is shorter, making it more sensitive to changes in interest rates. That makes it inherently harder to inflate debt away, like the UK after World War II. Second, much more of it is in the hands of foreign investors. Third, the trend of real interest rates in the U.S. seems less likely to be downward than it was in 1930s Britain. Whereas British real interest rates fell in the Depression, in America, they're currently projected by the CBO to rise from 1.7% in 24 to 1.9% in 26, declining slightly to 1.8% in 34. The real growth rate of the economy is projected to be almost identical. In this scenario, America's debt will cost more to service in the period of 25 through 35 than it did in 15 through 25, when the average real rate was 0.3%, especially because the stock of debt will continue to grow. And finally, the U.S. today is encumbered with an expensive welfare system designed for a society with higher fertility rates and lower life expectancy. Entitlement programs such as Social Security and Medicare are now the biggest items of federal expenditure. They will only become more expensive as the population ages. History suggests that any sustained period when a great power spends more on interest payments than on military capabilities is likely to see its strategic rivals challenge its position. The tension between, quote, guns and coupons being the interest-bearing parts of bonds, may also undermine its domestic stability as governments try and fail to meet the competing demands of generals, bondholders, taxpayers, and welfare recipients. In the absence of radical reform of America's principal entitlement programs, which successive administrations this century have either failed to achieve or ruled out, the only possible way the U.S. can come back within the limits of Ferguson's Law is therefore through a productivity miracle. Today, it might seem that the world is divided between the mighty American Trumpire and the feeble foreign competition. But the real contest of the second quarter of the 21st century may be between the much-vaunted economic promise of artificial intelligence and history in the form of Ferguson's Law. All right. Well, that's the article there, Brian. I think you can tell that thing really cuts to the themes that we always bring to the front here at System Failure, that of the relationship between debt and society's rise and society's fall.
Well, I guess using like defense spending as the metric for when the amount of debt has gone out of control, to me feels like a little arbitrary, although obviously he's got some historical examples there to back his point.
It certainly is arbitrary. I mean, it's an arbitrary measure, but if you compare the same arbitrary measure, across time, then maybe it can tell you something. But arbitrary, it certainly is.
Well, in any case, like obviously spending a crazy amount servicing debt rather than spending the money on useful things is not a good place to be. I mean, how much of our defense spending? I mean, does defense spending include crazy wars in the Middle East?
Yeah. Well, I noticed that the numbers that Mr. Ferguson brought to the fore there were around $1 trillion. So the Pentagon budget's about $700 billion. And then there's other, like the research and development he cited there. But then there's also the black budgets, which we don't get to see because they're classified. Obviously, that's why the war on drugs is important, right? If you have intelligence services that need money that's not subject to congressional approval, what you can have is a bunch of substances, make them illegal, and blow up their price on the black market, and then you can, sell those drugs and make huge amounts of money that you can then use to fund, all sorts of nefarious misdeeds
and
around the world.
Yeah, arrest the people you sell the drugs to,
yes.
Repossess the drugs, and sell them again.
Yes, that is the American way, eh, Brian? Well, my reaction. See, I come at this story like I have my many disagreements with what I've heard Ferguson say over the years, but I really liked his article. But I come to it as this crazy heretic who doesn't believe in the state religion of America. And what I mean by that is that I think that the reason that we borrow money is not for fiscal reasons at all. I think that we borrow money to maintain a monopoly on currency issuances. So that is to say, I think that when Maui burns or when Los Angeles burns, the federal government doesn't come in and rebuild those houses because they don't want us all to realize that we can award ourselves money for free. Right? We don't have to borrow it from the banks. Right? I think the banks want to maintain a monopoly on currency issuance. Right? That's what we mean when we say we have a debt-based currency. So I'll hash this out a little bit more. The current economic paradigm, the way that the federal budget currently works, is a mixture of taxes and spending and borrowing. And to my mind, the borrowing is wholly unnecessary. Right? Now, under both scenarios, if we tax and spend and borrow to run the federal budget versus just taxing and spending, we still, under scenario A and under scenario B, we have to manage inflation under both scenarios. So obviously, if you print too many dollars, you'll screw up the ratio of dollars to goods and services, and you can get an inflation that way. Right? Obviously, it's not the only cause of inflation, but it is a concern. Right? That's why the government just doesn't print willy-nilly. But we could use taxation in concert with spending to manage the amount of dollars in circulation at any given time. We do not need the borrowing aspect of that also, right? That I think is, I really believe that the one of the ideas that I'm always writing about in the Substack essays is the idea that the power of the papacy, was in a state of decline in the late Middle Ages and was ultimately replaced by these international banking houses as the masters of international geopolitics. And I think that and central to that scheme is having a central bank that issues your currency for you, right? And the great parable that illustrates the point is when Lincoln sent his Secretary of State, a certain Mr. Seward, to Europe to inquire at the Rothschilds banks about taking out a few loans to help finance the Civil War effort. And when the Rothschilds banks quoted ridiculous amounts to the Lincoln administration, ridiculous interest rates to the Lincoln administration, they decided to just print their own currency without first borrowing it from the banks, right? This is really what the paradigm we live in is that, like, the government is still printing the money, we're just also borrowing money in addition to that, but we could remove money from circulation with taxation as well as borrowing. So, like, the point here is that we are propping up a debt-based currency by awarding the banks a monopoly on currency issuance. That's what they do when they make loans. And go ahead.
And just with regards to your Civil War example, like weren't wasn't like England or something backing the South for that very reason, because we were kind of in this economic battle, partly because of the greenback.
Well, that is a great observation. The British had a vested interest in the Confederacy winning the Civil War, right? If you read that book Gettysburg by Michael Shara, off which the Jeff Bridges movie of 1992 was based, it's all about Gettysburg. There's a British attaché to General Lee's camp who is one of the characters that the book follows around, and so the character makes an appearance in the movie too. And the reason for that is that slave-grown King Cotton from the American South was being imported by the British to their textile manufacturing mills in central England, like Manchester, and then those textiles were being resold in the Raj in India, where only the English East India Company had they had a monopoly on the right to sell textiles, right? So they were running this crazy scam, right? You get super cheap King Cotton from the American South, grown by slaves, right? Low cost of production, turn it into textiles in Manchester, and then award the East India Company a monopoly on the whole thing, shipping from America to England, and then shipping the finished textiles from England to the Raj, and then selling them the Raj at monopoly prices, right? So that's why the Brits were like, we really would not like to see the North win the Civil War. It wouldn't be good for our global sea-based empire. All right, so you're exactly right. And so I don't know if the Rothschilds were motivated to not lend to the Lincoln administration because of that, or if they had other reasons. But whatever the case may be, Lincoln was like, we're not going to participate in your crazy monopoly on currency issuance. We're just going to create our own currency. We are, after all, a currency issuing government. We can create all the currency we want, right? There's no reason to borrow it. Now, again, introducing currency into the economy, whether you've borrowed it or not, is going to, can cause an inflation. So you have to be careful with how many dollars you introduce into circulation. But you don't have to be careful when it comes to things like building bridges. If the government prints a bunch of money to build a bridge, but then a whole bunch of businesses that were not economically viable suddenly become economically viable because of the decreased cost of transporting goods across that body of water. Well, now you've really spent money on an investment, right? You've spent money to make money. versus spending money for tax cuts for the rich, which is something that's been very popular in America since the 80s. So the irony here, the central irony of this whole thing that I think is very funny, when I read that article, I go, yeah, there's no reason for us to be borrowing. The problem here, what Ferguson is really saying is the issue is that as the years wear on, we're owing more and more and more of our collective national output to these rich people, the banks, foreign and domestic, wealthy investors. And there is no reason for us to run the government in such a way that more and more of all of our annual labor is claimed by a smaller and smaller group of people. Right? That is the fundamental issue here. So I think if we had Ferguson in this room and we asked him, like, look, isn't all this borrowing unnecessary? Can't we manage the volume of currency in the economy just fine through taxing on the one hand and spending on the other? I'm sure he'd be aghast. But, no. The borrowing is super crucially necessary. It gives us fiscal prudence. It forces the government to be fiscally prudent, having to funnel all of our public expenditures through private debt markets. And that's ironic because Ferguson has just written an entire article about how that very dynamic failed to stop empires from going into crazy debt and blowing themselves up. It's like, okay, so if borrowing is such an important thing, then why is it the case that it's ending all these empires you've bothered to list for us? So that is really what I think of that article in a nutshell. We could just simply print the money we need instead of having to go to the rich hat in hand and borrow money from them and also pay interest. You could just, if you need the rich people's money, right? If taking it from them and spending in the economy is not going to cause an inflation, we can just tax it from them. There's no reason that we have to borrow it from them at interest. We just believe that banks are just the way that society works, and that we have this belief that banks, we put our deposit in the banks, and then when you go to take out your loan for your mortgage, the bank is loaning you the money of other thrifty depositors in the community. You put their money. That's not true at all, right? You can tell because we have a fractional reserve banking system, and you can tell that we have a fractional reserve banking system because if you put $100 in the bank and then the bank loans that $100 out to the next customer, they don't draw down your savings account. Your account still says $100, and now they've loaned your account. They've loaned your $100 to the next person. That person has bank credit of $100, and you have a bank debit of $100. You can spend at the coffee shop. You can spend money on your debit card right next to them spending money on their credit card. Right? That's the fact that the bank does not draw down your balances when it loans out your money tells you that they're making money, they're creating money out of thin air to loan out. And that's what's going on. The banks are able to they whip up this product out of thin air and then rent it to us for actual like hard-earned money that we didn't whip up out of thin air, that we actually worked for. And that debt overhang tends to grow over time to the point where it brings down entire empires. And then just one final note here on history. You can tell this is true, right? You know that in order for the U.S. government to collect back its first U.S. dollar in tax revenue, it first must seed the economy with U.S. dollars by spending it into the economy, right? In order to collect, the U.S. government cannot collect dollar number one until they have spent some dollars into the economy to collect, right? And then the delta between what the government has spent into the economy and what it's collected back in tax revenues, well, that is the amount of money that's in circulation, that's being used. And so, like, just when you look at the history of the United States, you look at the end of World War I. The United States government was spending all this money on World War I. Then World War I came to an end, and they stopped producing. They stopped those expenditures. And as a result of that, and then there was also a lot of industrialization in the 20s. You're thinking about just think about the coming of the modern age. Everyone's house is getting electrified. Indoor plumbing is coming online. So you have all this massive economic growth in the 20s combined with a precipitous decline in public spending. What happens? The government runs a surplus, right? Now, our way of conceptualizing government debt as household debt tells us that that's a good thing, that we're paying down debt, that's what you want to do when you have good economic times. You want your economy to grow and government expenditures to go down. That's a good thing, right? But think about what we just talked about with respect to the government seeding money into the economy before taxing it back out of the economy, right? The point is that in the 20s, when the government was running their budget surplus, they were removing U.S. dollars from circulation, right? When the government taxes more dollars back than it spends into circulation, there's less dollars in circulation now. The net financial assets available to the private sector went down during the 20s as a result of this budget surplus. And of course, the massive market collapse was not far away. And so when World War II came to an end, the U.S. had a similar, we got through the Great Depression, World War II. Everyone was afraid about backsliding into a depression, as referenced by Mr. Ferguson's article there, excuse me, talking about the Brits after World War II. Well, it was the same here in the U.S. So we did not pay down our war debt after World War II. We just allowed the economy to expand and grow and make that debt shrink the proportion of that debt with respect to the rest of the economy. And because we didn't aggressively pay down the debt, we went through boom times. This was the great era of Keynesianism, named for British economist, John Maynard Keynes. And the idea was the government was paranoid about another Great Depression, and so they wanted to spend to keep spending rather than dropping spending after the war. They kept spending apace. And a big part of that story, of course, is the Cold War. We went right from World War II into the Cold War with nary a break in between. And so we didn't have budget surpluses in the 50s like we had in the 20s. But the budget surpluses came home to roost again under the Clinton administration in the 1990s. You may recall this. It was the Cold War came to an end. Government spending went way down after the Cold War. We thought we were going to get this peace dividend. The Clinton administration started paying off the government debt. We ran a surplus for years. And we also saw massive economic growth thanks to computers being introduced in the economy in the 90s. And I refer, of course, to the infamous dot-com bubble, right? And inevitably, when the government ran a surplus again, there was a great contraction in the amount of dollars available in the economy, right? The net financial assets available to the private sector went down because the government rounded up more tax dollars than it handed out that year, right? That's a budget surplus. And it resulted inevitably in a monster economic collapse in the early 2000s, the dot-com collapse, right? So the point here is that it's easy to think of the government spending as some kind of a household where it's bad. You want to make sure you're not... You want to balance. You want to make sure that your revenues don't outpace your expenses. But the government is actually the inverse. It is critical that the government maintain a deficit. Right. It is critical they not remove more dollars from the U.S. economy than they're putting in a context where the economy is staying the same or expanding. Right. If you have a shrinking economy, you might very well think about removing dollars from circulation to match the amount of dollars to the quantity of goods and services on offer. But I will repeat the punchline here. All of this borrowing seems obviously unnecessary to me. It seems like we are all roped into this financial scam, and questioning whether or not the government actually needs to borrow is like, questioning the papacy during the Middle Ages. We just don't do it. And so you won't find Ferguson questioning the basic assumption that we need public debt goes unquestioned in an article about the horrifying pitfalls of public debt, which is extremely funny to me. Here's all the ways this can blow up on our face. No examination of whether or not we actually need to be packing those explosives. So, that is my lengthy and long thoughts on that article, Brian. I wonder if you had any immediate impressions. We are coming up on the hour mark, and I am aware that our listeners' ears must be bleeding at this point. What are your thoughts?
Let me think. Well, I mean, obviously, we've moved away from the practice of taxing rich people to borrowing money from them.
Perish the thought, tax the wealthy.
Yeah. So, I mean, that doesn't seem good. So I guess, are you suggesting that we don't need to tax people?
Oh, we need to tax, and we need to spend. We do not need to borrow. I'm suggesting that anywhere that borrowing is helpful, taxing would be equally helpful.
Well, anyway, I mean, ultimately it's like these private banks like really run the government, and we got the central bank installed in 1920 or whatever. But I mean, really, it's like a private institution to make some people rich, and I think they don't mind if the American empire collapses because they've already plundered it for everything it's worth. And so, I mean, the Federal Reserve is like the Federal Express or FedEx.
That's the line, yeah. The Federal Reserve is no more federal than Federal Express. I like that.
Yeah, it's from that Zeitgeist movie, right?
Is that where it comes from? I've heard it any number of places.
First place I heard about it in college, anyway. And so, I think these people just don't mind crashing the American economy into the ground, and it's probably good for them if that does happen.
Yes,
and so they're not to be trusted.
I think you're right. In Christmas Day of the year 800, I always talk about this little anecdote, but the Pope snuck up behind Charlemagne as he was kneeling to recite his Christmas prayers in Old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and slapped the crown of the Holy Roman Empire on his head, thereby establishing the Pope as the guy that crowns the emperors, right? And the Pope established himself as a political authority over Charlemagne by doing this. So I didn't warn him about it. I just did it out of the blue, and that political order lasted from 800 all the way up until the Treaty of Westphalen that Ferguson mentioned in his article of 1648, and just as just as like the crowned heads of Christendom were like franchises of the Vatican, the presidents and the chancellors and the prime ministers of all of the democracy, the industrialized democracies today are franchises of this banking system that sits above it, in just the way that the Pope sat above the political system of Europe throughout the Middle Ages. Well, that's what I think anyway. And the fact that Ferguson can go through a whole article about the dangers of public debt and never once question if it's necessary tells me that, that it seems like we're getting close to the state religion or the unquestioned, fundamentally held beliefs of our society when I read an article like that. So that's what it is. I hope that you all you listeners out there did not mind hearing the article in its entirety. I really got a big thrill out of it. I hope that comes through in the recording.
All right.
Okay. All right, Brian. Well, as we approach the hour mark here, this is usually about the time when I encourage the intrepid System Failure listeners to head over to systemfailure.org. There you can enter your email address to receive the weekly essays written by yours truly every single Monday directly to your email inbox. That way you shan't have to worry about missing any of this riveting content. And if you'd like to get in touch with either Brian or myself, why, you can accomplish that feat over at systemfailure.org as well. We hope to see all of you online this week.
Alrighty. We'll see you.
Take care, everyone.